What's up, everybody? Welcome to the video. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. Former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, airline pilot flying the Boeing 737 and the Airbus A220. This is a genuinely significant first in this war. U.S. Marines physically boarded and seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship, the Touska, the first time that's happened to a major Iranian vessel during this entire conflict. Let's break down exactly how this went down, what it was actually carrying, and why this represents a real legal escalation, not just another strike. Quick roadmap. I'll walk through the actual boarding operation, then what's suspected to be on board and why that matters, then the legal framework the U.S. is using to justify this, then Iran's response, and finish with my take on what spoils of war actually means here. How the boarding actually happened. On April 19th, the Touska, a Panamax-class container ship built in 2007, roughly 54,151 gross tons, was transiting the North Arabian Sea at 17 knots, headed for Bandar Abbas, when USS Spruance, a guided missile destroyer, ordered it to turn around under the naval blockade the U.S. had been enforcing since April 13th. The ship ignored warnings for 6 hours. CENTCOM then confirmed Spruance fired its 5-inch Mk-45 gun directly into the ship's engine room, disabling it without harming the crew. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit launched from the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli, then rappelled aboard and took physical custody. Trump confirmed it directly on Truth Social. We have full custody of the ship and are seeing what's on board. Notably, Al Jazeera pointed out this is the first non-military Iranian ship the U.S. is known to have hit during this entire war. Everything before this had involved military vessels, IRGC boats, or strikes on shore facilities. This crossed into commercial shipping specifically. What it was actually carrying. This is where the secret weapons ship framing gets interesting. Reporting indicates the Touska was suspected of carrying dual-use materials sourced from China, specifically flagged as suitable for ballistic missile manufacturing, potentially including rocket fuel precursors. One detailed tracking analysis broke the likely cargo scenarios down as roughly 40% chance sanctions, busting oil, 45% chance dual-use electronics or machinery, and 15% chance actual weapons destined for Iranian proxies, noting a confirmed weapons finding, would escalate this to an entirely different category of conflict than a straightforward sanctions violation. CNN's own reporting on this specific interception noted the ship was found carrying a range of weaponry aboard, including a fully automatic weapon capable of firing 16 to 20 rounds per minute from a reloadable 20-round drum, plus torpedoes among other armaments. The ship's route is worth understanding too. It was reportedly attempting to reach Chabahar via the Gulf of Oman rather than transiting Hormuz directly, a routing pattern one analysis specifically flagged as a documented Iranian sanctions evasion pathway running through Port Klang in Malaysia. The interception in the Gulf of Oman, rather than at the strait itself, demonstrated something significant. The U.S. blockade perimeter extends well beyond the Hormuz choke point itself to cover the broader approaches to Iranian ports. The legal framework behind this, I want to explain the actual legal justification, because this genuinely marks a shift from strikes to something closer to naval prize law. The U.S. is asserting what's called the belligerent right to visit, board, search, and seize under traditional law of naval warfare, applying to vessels carrying either absolute contraband, weapons and military equipment, or conditional contraband, oil and dual-use goods, when destined for enemy use, anywhere beyond a nation's 12 nautical mile territorial waters. Critically, the U.S. doesn't need to prove weapons were aboard to justify the seizure. Under the expanded contraband list issued alongside the blockade, oil, electronics, and machinery destined for an OFAC-sanctioned entity in Iran is sufficient grounds on its own. CNN legal analysis went further. Retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster noted the ship itself, and potentially its cargo, can be treated as a spoils of war. The same legal category applied to enemy combatants or materials seized during armed conflict. That's a genuinely significant designation. It means this isn't simply detained pending return, it's treated as captured property under the laws of war. Iran's response, Iran called it maritime piracy, and a violation of international law, threatening retribution. CENTCOM and reports afterward indicated swarm drone strikes were launched against U.S. naval assets in the Gulf of Oman within hours, mostly intercepted by destroyer defense systems. Iran also threatened to close the strait entirely in response, and this all landed at a genuinely awkward diplomatic moment, hours before U.S. negotiators were due to head to Pakistan for talks aimed at ending the war, the exact mediation framework I've referenced in earlier videos on this conflict's diplomatic track. Understanding the ship itself, I want to give some background on the Touska as an actual vessel, because I think the technical details matter for understanding why this specific ship became such a significant test case. It's identified in shipping records as IMO 9328900, call sign EPB-S4, MMSI 422-2032-600, a Panamax-class container ship, meaning it's built to the maximum dimensions that can still transit the Panama Canal, roughly 54,851 gross tons, constructed in 2007 to 2008. That's a genuinely substantial commercial vessel, not a small coastal trader or fishing boat, the kind of ship that, under normal peacetime conditions, would be moving standard commercial container cargo through some of the world's busiest shipping lanes without drawing any particular attention. Trump specifically noted the ship was already under U.S. Treasury sanctions due to what he called a prior history of illegal activity, which tells you this wasn't the Touska's first appearance on the radar of American sanctions enforcement. That prior sanctions history likely factored directly into why the specific vessel drew such intensive scrutiny and such a dramatic response when it attempted to defy the blockade, rather than simply being redirected the way some of the other vessels I've covered in earlier videos on this war's naval blockade were. A previously sanctioned vessel attempting to breach an active wartime blockade represents a genuinely different risk profile than an ordinary commercial ship that might simply be caught in the crossfire of a rapidly changing legal situation it wasn't fully aware of. The Chabahar routing strategy deserves more explanation. I touched on the Port Klang to Chabahar routing pattern, but I want to explain why that specific path matters so much strategically. Chabahar, which I've covered in detail in earlier videos as Iran's only oceanic port, sitting outside the Strait of Hormuz entirely on the Gulf of Oman coast, has functioned throughout this war as Iran's primary hedge against exactly the kind of strait closure and blockade pressure I've documented extensively across this series. Attempting to reach Chabahar via a Gulf of Oman approach, rather than transiting the strait directly toward Bandar Abbas, represents a calculated bet that this specific route would draw less scrutiny than the heavily monitored strait choke point itself. That calculation turned out to be wrong, and the way it turned out to be wrong tells you something important about how comprehensively the U.S. blockade has actually been enforced. The USS Spruance interception happening in the Gulf of Oman, well outside the strait itself, demonstrates the blockade perimeter isn't narrowly focused on the physical choke point alone. It extends to cover the broader maritime approaches to Iranian ports generally. That's a meaningfully more comprehensive enforcement posture than a simple checkpoint at the strait's narrowest point would represent, and it suggests whoever routed the Touska through this specific pathway either underestimated how far U.S. naval surveillance and interdiction capability actually extended, or was making a calculated gamble that the lower traffic volume on this specific route would provide enough cover despite the broader blockade, a gamble that ultimately failed. What spoils of war actually means in practice. I want to spend more time on the legal designation Captain Schuster referenced because I don't think a single sentence fully captures what that classification actually implies going forward. Treating a seized vessel and its cargo as spoils of war, rather than simply detaining it pending inspection and potential return, means the ship and everything aboard it can potentially become the legal property of the seizing power, subject to whatever disposal or prize court process applies under the relevant legal framework. Historically, under traditional prize law, this would have involved an actual prize court process determining the legal status of the seized vessel and cargo, though modern practice varies considerably from those historical precedents. That distinction matters enormously for how you should understand the practical stakes of the seizure. If the Touska is treated purely as a detained vessel pending investigation, there's a reasonable expectation it and its crew could eventually be released once any sanctions violations are addressed through fines or other administrative remedies. If it's genuinely treated as spoils of war, that implies a much more permanent adversarial legal status. The ship itself becomes a casualty of the conflict in a legal sense, not just a commercial vessel caught breaking a wartime rule. That's exactly the kind of legal escalation that tends to harden a conflict's trajectory, because it removes some of the more routine, easily reversible off-ramps that simple detention and fines would otherwise provide. The crew's fate remains a genuinely open question. I mentioned briefly that the crew's fate depends on their nationalities, but I think this deserves more attention given how serious the stakes actually are for the individuals involved. If crew members are found to be affiliated with the IRGC specifically, or found to have been transporting or operating alongside actual weapons aboard the vessel, they could potentially be detained as prisoners of war, rather than simply processed as merchant sailors caught in a sanctions dispute. That's an enormous difference in legal status and personal consequence for the individuals aboard that ship, and it's exactly the kind of determination that likely depends heavily on whatever the eventual, still unreleased cargo manifest and crew background checks actually reveal. This is also worth connecting to the broader pattern of this war I've documented extensively, where the actual human cost and human stakes of individual incidents often get overshadowed by the larger strategic and military analysis. Whatever the geopolitical significance of this seizure turns out to be, there were real people aboard that ship when USS Spruance put a hole in its engine room, and their individual fates, innocent merchant sailors caught in the wrong place, or IRGC-affiliated personnel facing genuine prisoner of war status, remain a meaningful human dimension of this story that I think deserves acknowledgement even in a video primarily focused on the broader strategic and legal implications. The timing relative to the Pakistan talks is worth its own analysis. I mentioned this seizure landed hours before U.S. negotiators were due to head to Pakistan for talks aimed at ending the war, but I want to dig into why that timing is so significant rather than just noting it in passing. Pakistan's role as mediator in this conflict, which I've referenced across several videos on this war's diplomatic track, depends heavily on both sides maintaining at least some baseline confidence that the other party is negotiating in good faith, even while military operations continue. A dramatic, high-profile naval seizure landing in the immediate run-up to a scheduled round of talks sends a genuinely complicated signal. It could be read as the U.S. demonstrating strength and resolve specifically to negotiate from a position of maximum leverage, or it could be read by Iran as evidence that Washington isn't actually serious about de-escalation, undermining the entire premise of the talks before negotiators even arrive in Islamabad. This is a pattern I've now documented repeatedly throughout this war. Dramatic military actions landing at exactly the moments when diplomatic progress appears most fragile or most promising. I covered this same dynamic in my videos on the Hormuz talks and the CENTCOM email requesting unconventional pressure options, where the actual military posture and the actual diplomatic messaging often seem to be operating on parallel, not always coordinated tracks. Whether that reflects a deliberate strategy of maximizing pressure right up until the moment talks begin, or simply the reality that a war this large and this fast-moving doesn't pause neatly around a negotiating calendar, is hard to say definitively from the outside, but the pattern itself has held remarkably consistently across nearly every diplomatic milestone I've covered in this entire series. Why this sets a precedent beyond just this one ship. I want to close out this expanded section by thinking through the precedent-setting implications more explicitly, because I think that's ultimately the most important thing this specific incident tells you about the rest of this war. Every commercial shipping company, every insurer, every flag registry with vessels potentially transiting anywhere near Iranian waters or carrying cargo that could plausibly be characterized as dual use now has concrete, demonstrated proof that the U.S. blockade isn't merely a rhetorical policy. It's being actively enforced through disabling gunfire and armed marine boarding parties, applied broadly enough to reach vessels attempting alternate routes through the Gulf of Oman, specifically to avoid the primary strait choke point. That demonstrated enforcement capability changes the risk calculus for every future vessel considering whether to test this blockade. In exactly the same way, I've described the interception numbers changing Iran's own calculus around missile launches in my video on the cumulative missile statistics from this war. Deterrence works through demonstrated willingness to follow through, and the Touska seizure represents about as clear a demonstration as this war has produced that the naval blockade specifically carries real physical teeth, not just declared legal authority. I think that's exactly why this incident, even though it involves a single commercial vessel rather than a dramatic strike on Iranian territory, deserves to be understood as one of the more strategically consequential moments in this entire conflict's maritime dimension. My take as a pilot: I think the shift from strikes to an actual physical boarding and seizure represents a meaningful escalation in legal category, even if it doesn't generate the same visual drama as a bombing run. Strikes degrade capability. This asserts something different: active naval control over what can and can't move in and out of Iranian ports, backed by prize law rather than just deterrence. Whether the confirmed cargo turns out to be genuine missile precursor materials or simply sanctioned oil, the precedent matters just as much as the specific contents. The U.S. has now demonstrated it's willing to physically stop, disable, board, and claim an Iranian commercial vessel as spoils of war. And that changes the calculus for every ship operator considering whether to test this blockade going forward. I also think this incident is a genuinely useful case study for understanding how modern naval blockade enforcement actually differs from the popular imagination of what a blockade looks like. This wasn't a static line of warships physically preventing passage through a narrow choke point. It was an intelligence-driven interdiction operation, tracking a specific vessel's suspicious routing pattern, identifying it as a probable sanctions evasion attempt based on its Port Klang to Chabahar pathway, and then executing a precise disabling strike, followed by an armed boarding, all while deliberately avoiding crew casualties. That's a genuinely sophisticated operational picture, closer to a targeted law enforcement action backed by naval firepower than to the kind of blunt area denial blockade most people associate with the term historically. Understanding that distinction helps explain why this specific incident required the coordination of a guided missile destroyer, an amphibious assault ship, and an entire Marine expeditionary unit, rather than simply stationing ships at a choke point and waiting. Wrapping it up, so that's the Touska story, the first physical seizure of a major Iranian cargo vessel in this war, suspected dual-use missile materials aboard, a 6-hour standoff ending in a disabled engine room and a Marine boarding party, a legal framework treating the whole thing as spoils of war, and a genuinely uncertain fate still hanging over the crew depending on their nationalities and any IRGC affiliations that eventually get confirmed. Landing hours before scheduled talks in Pakistan, this incident captures something I've now documented repeatedly throughout this entire war. The military and diplomatic tracks of this conflict rarely seem to pause for each other, even at moments when you'd expect one to defer to the other. I'll keep tracking how this affects the broader Hormuz standoff, and whether the demonstrated willingness to seize vessels, this dramatically changes shipping behavior around the blockade, going forward the way I'd expect it to based on the deterrence patterns I've documented elsewhere in this war. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and hit subscribe for the next update. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.